Welcome to Books of Our Time, produced by the Massachusetts School of Law and seen nationwide. Today we shall discuss Perilous Times, a book about the history and law of free speech in wartime. The book is by Geoffrey Stone, who is here to discuss his work. Jeff Stone is a professor of law at the University of Chicago Law School, where he was dean of the law school from 1987 to 1993. He also served as provost of the University of Chicago from 1993 to 2002. He is the author or co-author of numerous articles and books on constitutional law. And I am Lawrence R. Velvel, the Dean of the Massachusetts School of Law. Jeff, thank you very much for flying in to be with us today and for being with our faculty at lunch. And since you said a lot of things at lunch, I'm a little embarrassed that you destroyed my vision of the next question, or the first question. But let me ask it anyway, and you can tell it as it actually was rather than how I envisioned it. And that is, what were you trying to accomplish in Perilous Times? How did you come to write the book? What did you attempt to teach by the book? What perceptions do you want people to take away from the book?
Well, the how I came to write it, as I told you earlier, was quite serendipitous. As you said, I had been provost of the University of Chicago for 8 years, and when I decided to step down from that position, the university's news and information director interviewed me to write a story for university publication about my legacy as provost. And during the course of that interview, he asked me, you've been 15 years now doing university and law school administration. You must be very eager to get back into the saddle and be writing some scholarship, and you must have a long list of projects that you want to do. And so what's the first thing you want to get at? And the truth is, I thought to myself, I've spent the last 8 years thinking about where to locate biological science laboratories and whether to build a university swimming pool and which faculty members should get tenure and which should not. And the last thing I thought about was what to do in terms of my own research agenda. So I just blurted out off the top of my head that I would write a book on free speech in wartime. And I thought I dodged a bullet, and that was that. And then the next day in the university paper, the story came out that said, provost steps down, returns to law school to write book on free speech in wartime. And I received about 100 emails that day from colleagues of mine at the university saying, this is a great project, and it's wonderful, and we can't wait to see it. And so I found myself trapped. And the book itself...
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
This goes beyond what you had said before. I have found in life, Jeff, that when I blurt things out spur of the moment, people think one hasn't thought about things, but in fact what has happened is that you thought about things a long time, many times before, and it didn't come out spur of the moment. It's a product of a long period of rumination. Was this really somewhere in the back of your mind before that?
Well, I had taught and written about the First Amendment all of my career, but at least as I now recall it, which may be apocryphal, but as I now recall it, the idea of this book did not really exist until that moment. But I may now be simply fooling myself because it's a nice story to tell.
Yeah.
But that is what I believe.
Okay.
As I began thinking about it, though, it became clear that this was an important subject at an important time in our history. It's a book that hasn't been written, and no one had done anything quite like it for at least 80 years. I hoped in writing this book to be able to reach a very different audience from the type of audience I usually write for, which are my 6 best friends who live and breathe the First Amendment 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
And so it was a real challenge to write a book for a more general audience, but I was very pleased with the whole process. It was very exciting to do.
Yeah. You say that there's been nothing like it for 80 years. What was written 80 years ago?
Zechariah Chafee, who was a Harvard law professor, wrote a book, Free Speech in the United States, that really did for that era what I would like to think that Perilous Times did for this era.
Yeah. Jeff, I find, as you know, I find the book to be unique and uniquely valuable. It is a melding of law and history in a way that is extremely relevant to many fields, and yet one rarely, if ever, sees in any field. And here we have it in this very important arena of freedom of speech in wartime. And it is often said that history does not repeat itself, but it comes in patterns. And I think that you have identified several patterns that we see in the history of free speech in wartime. What would some of those patterns be?
Well, one is clearly an impetus to overreact to the pressures of wartime in terms of government repression of dissent, that in each of the various episodes that I discuss in the book, which begin with 1798 and run through the Civil War, World War I, World War II, the Cold War, and Vietnam, the government lashes out, punishes dissenters, undermines the capacity of individuals to dissent, and then later, after the dust is settled, there's a reckoning, and the American people and the press and government officials say, what did we do? That was wrong, it was unnecessary, it did not serve our country well. Nonetheless, we have this pattern that repeats itself episode after episode. So that's the most large level of the issue is that. Other phenomena that tie into this is that oftentimes the driving force behind this is a desire on the part of political opportunists, sometimes people in power, sometimes people who want to obtain power, using the crisis mentality of a wartime environment as a way to generate anxiety and fear and to turn that, in effect, to their own political advantage so as to solidify or to secure their power. And that's one of the exacerbating features of this.
Joseph McCarthy would be perhaps the prime example in American history.
Joe McCarthy would be certainly the prime example. And the period after World War II, the Cold War, was an instance in which the Republicans had been out of control in Washington for some 16 years. And Republicans, not only Joe McCarthy, but even more mainstream Republicans, saw the red card as a way of attacking the Democrats and charging that they had essentially failed to protect the United States, right, failed to watch the store during the time that they were in power, and the only way America could be safe, the only way Americans could guarantee their own security was to throw out the Democrats and put the Republicans back in.
20 years of treason, it was called.
Exactly right,
yeah.
Yes.
So you see these patterns in history, and we will come back to them because they permeate the book. They are interwoven throughout the book. But now I know the answer to the question I wanted to ask, but I'd like the public to know. The question originally had been, were you trained in history, an autodidactical reader? Did you read it specifically for this book? I mean, these days, people are often so narrow-mindedly specialized that it is rare to find somebody with true expertise in more than one field. How did you come to have this expertise? Of course, in First Amendment law, you've had that for 35 years, but how did you also come to have this expertise in history?
Well, I don't know that I actually claim expertise in history. I have no formal advanced training in history. I've always enjoyed reading it. But as I started writing this book, I originally envisioned it as a book much more about the Supreme Court. And as I began work on it, I realized that so much more was happening than just at the Supreme Court level in these episodes, at the state legislatures, in the federal Congress, in the congressional debates over legislation, in the media, in higher education, and that to tell the story, to explain and to understand what was happening, that to look only at the Supreme Court was to miss the guts of what actually was causing these phenomena to take place. And so I basically learned this myself as I went through the process of writing the book. And I had, in a sense, the great advantage of having worked as provost before this, and I was working 19-hour days. And one of the things I was uneasy about when I decided to step down was what would I do with the 11 hours a day that wasn't already going to be predetermined, and essentially this book filled that for me. So learning that history was a way not only to write the book, but also to sort of adjust my life from being somebody who did nothing but work to somebody who actually lives a relatively normal life now.
Right. Would you say that the Supreme Court and the courts generally are, to a greater extent than not, merely a reflection of what was going on in society at each of these times?
In general, I think courts have tended to reflect the attitudes of the society as a whole. Judges and justices live within that society, they live within the culture. If there are fears and anxieties that are pervasive among the citizens, then they're likely to exist among the individuals who are judges as well. They're not insulated from that. So in fact, they do, for the most part, tend to reflect those general social views. And beyond that, they have a difficult role to play in these settings. On the one hand, they should see themselves, and often do see themselves, as the ultimate protectors and guardians of our constitutional liberties. On the other hand, when they get involved in matters where the executive branch claims that national security or military security demand a certain degree of deference from the courts to military officials who know much better than they do the consequences and the stakes in any given dispute, judges tend to feel a lack of certainty about their ability to be wise about matters that they do not have complete familiarity with. So they've tended historically to give too much deference to military officials. And part of what I argue in the book is that judges need to learn from their own experience that the record in the past has been a disappointing one because they have too often deferred in situations where, with fuller knowledge, it was clear that that deference was unjustified, and the consequence has often been very bad actions on the part of our government that were ratified by the courts.
Yeah, justified meaning precisely that. There was no danger that we were facing that justified what was going on. I think I'd like to bring in something, Jeff, which when the Guantanamo case came before the Supreme Court, you wrote an amicus curiae brief, which is a friend of the court brief, on behalf of Fred Korematsu. And you sent it to me, and as I told the faculty, I think I wrote you back an email or a letter saying that was, if not the best brief I'd ever written, it was certainly right up there with them. And the essence of what you said to the court, and I think it's reflected in, whether it's because of you or for whatever reason, it's reflected in the court's opinion, is remember history when you folks gave deference to the executive time and again this was proven to be a wrong thing to do. And this time, they seem to listen to that kind of idea.
Well, this was exactly the point of the brief. When I was invited to write this brief on behalf of Mr. Korematsu, who, by the way, passed away only about a month ago, and for those of your audience who don't know, Fred Korematsu was the individual whose case went to the Supreme Court in 1944, in which the court upheld the constitutionality of the Japanese internment. And he was therefore a particularly important symbol of misjudgment on the part of the court, failure on the part of the Supreme Court in its history. And so given the opportunity to present his position in a matter like this, it seemed to me a terrific moment in which to remind the court that it has had these instances in its own history and too often has abdicated its responsibilities, and these justices do not want to be remembered as the next generation of justices who failed their country. And so that was the primary point of the brief, and I would like to think that it had some impact. In fact, there was a genesis of both the brief and the book in the Supreme Court, because several years ago I was invited to give the annual Supreme Court Historical Society lecture in the Supreme Court chamber, and a number of the justices were present. And that's where I first presented, in a very rough form, the thesis that eventually became the book and eventually became the brief. So I had two shots at the apple, actually. I first had a shot to give the lecture to the court in the Supreme Court, and then 4 years later had the opportunity to submit the brief that reiterated the point.
Was this while you were provost?
This was in the spring after I was provost, when I was first beginning to start work on the book.
You mentioned in the book, and I know that when I used to teach constitutional law, which I haven't done for nearly 30 years, I used to mention that as a matter of history, there was not one incident ever reported involving a Japanese American on the West Coast. No sabotage, no spying, no nothing.
Correct.
Yeah, and yet they got moved, and as we'll get into, the Japanese in Hawaii, the Japanese Americans in Hawaii did not, which I think is purely a tribute to political numbers and power.
Right, well, the internment of the Japanese Americans is one of the truly black marks on this country's history, and it came about largely because of an irrational panic on the West Coast that was not founded in any fact. The fact that there were commercial interests on the West Coast that were eager to eliminate Japanese American competition, and the fact that there was a long entrenched racism on the West Coast, and that all these things fed in together to produce the internment.
And I understand. I don't mean to be going off on this one thing too much, Jeff, but since it is such a keen event in American history, at some point, a judge on the West Coast, a federal judge, Mary Schroeder, who happens to be a 1964 graduate of your law school, something
Correct.
that too many people would know, ruled that the government had actually committed fraud upon the courts in that case because it had presented untruths to the courts to justify what it had done.
Right. The original decision of military authorities on the West Coast to recommend the internment of individuals of Japanese descent was explicitly based largely on political and racist justifications. And when it came time to present that argument higher up in the military, that original document was destroyed by military superiors who redrafted a new document that purported to justify the internment on grounds of military necessity. And when the Justice Department asked the military in its preparation to argue the Korematsu case for all documents that had existed, they were denied access to the original document that had made clear that the justification had nothing to do with military necessity and everything to do with public panic and political considerations.
Which is one of your overall themes. There's always some kind of unjustified panic. One of the points that you raised, Jeff, and that we talked about at lunch, but it's raised extensively in the book, time and again, is why permit freedom of speech in wartime when, after all, you're taking away completely the freedom of conscripted soldiers who not only can't say what they think, they might die. Why permit freedom of speech to the rest of the country?
Well, free speech is not merely an individual liberty that belongs to the person in the same way that many other liberties may be thought to exist, but it's also an essential component of how we make decisions in a self-governing society. And there's no more important matter about which we make decisions than whether to go to war, how to fight a war, whether we're in fact fighting a war well and morally and within proper limits. And therefore, public debate during a war about the justness and the nature of the war itself are fundamental to enable individual citizens to make judgments, to communicate those judgments to their elected representatives, and ultimately to make decisions at election time about who their elected representative should be. And if people are stifled in their ability to talk openly about the war, then they, as the society as a whole, winds up having the thinking process of the nation corrupted and distorted, and they're not able to think correctly, and they're forced, therefore, to essentially yield to government officials who will then have all the information in their control and will be the only ones who've had an opportunity to reflect on the matter. So free speech is not just a matter of I get the satisfaction of speaking. It is an essential component of democracy and how decisions are made in democracy. And stifling free speech is essentially to cripple democracy itself and to lead to bad decision making. And that's the basic premise of the American government, is that if you prevent free speech on issues of fundamental public importance, then you will reach less good decisions than if you allow free speech.
Let's go through some of the periods you talk about with specific regard to the point that you just made. And let me say that I'm shocked. I was shocked to read in the book how some of the most reviled dissenters turned out to be right, people who were thrown in jail. How about World War I? What were the reasons given by the government for that war? What did the dissenters say? And historically, to what extent have the dissenters been thought right?
Well, with World War I, it's important to remember that in 1916, Woodrow Wilson was reelected on the platform that he kept us out of war. And the reason that was such a popular platform was that, for the most part, Americans regarded the combat on European battlefields, which had wreaked carnage on those nations, as affecting no vital interests of the United States. And so the vast majority of Americans wanted no part of that war, and they did not regard it as relevant to our interests. And Wilson took the same view, and that was how he campaigned in 16. What finally brought Wilson to the position of seeking a declaration of war was German submarine warfare. And to understand that, it's important to realize that under international law, the general view is that neutrals have a right to trade with belligerents. And belligerents are not supposed to prevent neutrals from trading with other belligerents. England and France effectively prevented the United States from trading with Germany because Germany had very little access to the sea, and so all they had to do was mine a couple of rivers and harbors, and American shipping simply couldn't go there. But because England and France had vast access to the sea, the only way Germany could reciprocate was by declaring submarine warfare. And so Germany essentially said to the United States, do not ship armaments, munitions, or other war-related supplies to England and France. If you do, we will sink the ships. And because American merchant ships continued to test that, a number of them were sunk by the Germans. Wilson finally decided that he'd had enough, and he, instead of stopping the shipping, he essentially declared war. Now, many Americans took the view that this was not, as Wilson now put it, a war to make the world safe for democracy, but rather a war to make the world safe for munitions and armaments manufacturers. And their view was that there was a simple solution here, which was that the United States could simply step aside, let the nations of Europe fight it out with one another, and simply not trade with them during the conduct of the war, rather than get ourselves embroiled in a war in which millions of soldiers had already died. And so when the declaration of war was voted on and approved, there was, right from the get-go, substantial dissent in the United States about the reasons for going to war. And for the most part, the objection was that this was a war for capitalism, not a war for democracy.
But before we go to break, which we have to do in just a few seconds, in your book I read, I don't think I'd ever read this before, but it certainly seemed in context to make sense, that there were people who said we fought this war because, had we not fought it, the Germans likely would have won, and these billions of dollars in debts run up to us by England and France would have been worthless.
Right. Yeah, that was the other argument that was being made on the government, was that we had essentially loaned huge amounts of money to England and France, and the concern was that if Germany won the war, that they would renege on those debts, and that many of the banks in the United States and bankers in the United States would lose, as you say, billions of dollars. So
didn't that happen anyway, by the way?
Ultimately, I think there were deals that were made that wound up having most of those loans forgiven. Exactly right. So yes, and so what history tells us, history is very confusing about World War I. Nobody really, to my knowledge, has a definitive answer to the question of why the war was fought in any level. And whether the world would have been a better place with us in it as we eventually entered, or whether it would have been a better place if we not entered it, who knows? Because so much happens after that, including the rise of Nazi Germany, that the cause and effect is very difficult. But certainly there was strong opposition to World War I, and the Wilson administration did everything possible to stifle that opposition.
Yeah. Jeff, we have to go to break. Stay with us. We'll be right back after a short announcement.
Every time an adult gives up on our kids, every time we surrender to the belief that their future is out of our hands, another child is left behind. I'm General Colin Powell, and I don't believe in giving up. That's why I'm asking you to join America's Promise. Log on to americaspromise.org or give us a call. Whoever you are, wherever you are, you can do something important. Pull your weight.
They won't leave you for someone younger. They won't notice you've gained weight. They won't fire you. They won't talk about you behind your back. All they'll ever do is love you. Find the love of your life. Visit Petfinder at aspca.org.
Hey, this phone's taken. son, will this help you?
Maybe the last thing you would do for somebody should be the first.
Thanks. Hey, I appreciate it.
A message from the Credit Union Foundation and your hometown credit union.
Welcome back. Jeff, with regard to World War II, there were German sympathizers, to put it mildly, in this country, known as the Silver Shirts and the Bund, and they were headed by a fellow named Pelly. After the war, I guess, there was also writing by a fellow named John Mearsheimer, who I gather is a legitimate historian. And what shocked me is the extent to which Pelly was right, you might put it this way, telling the truth about Pearl Harbor when the government was denying it, and also Mearsheimer's views on why and how we got into that war. These reflect on the importance of freedom of speech. Can you elaborate this for us?
Sure. Well, Pelly was the founder of the Silver Shirts, which were essentially a proto-Nazi organization in the United States. Pelly himself was a fascinating character who was a quite successful writer and screenwriter, wrote a number of movies out in Hollywood, but who founded the Silver Shirts. And when World War II began, he published a number of journals that were sharply critical of Roosevelt and the Roosevelt administration. In particular, he maintained that the United States had suffered a much more serious blow at Pearl Harbor than Roosevelt had let on. And he also accused the administration of having essentially manipulated the Japanese into a position where they had no recourse but to attack the United States because of the oil embargo that the U.S. had inflicted upon them. And this infuriated Roosevelt. And Roosevelt demanded that his Attorney General, Francis Biddle, indict Pelly and prosecute him. And Biddle resisted this. Biddle kept saying, no, Pelly has a First Amendment right to do this, and I don't believe we should be engaging in prosecution of seditious libel. But Roosevelt nonetheless persisted, and Biddle finally did indict Pelly, who was prosecuted for making false statements designed to aid the enemy. That was the charge that was lodged against him. And the false statements were essentially statements like the United States is bankrupt, that there is division of opinion in this country about the war, that the losses at Pearl Harbor were far more severe than Roosevelt had admitted, and that Roosevelt could have kept the United States out of the war and could have avoided Pearl Harbor, but he actually engineered it by baiting the Japanese.
Because he wanted to get into the war against Germany.
Because he wanted to get into the war against Germany, exactly.
Yeah.
And so Pelly was prosecuted on this basis, and the evidence presented by the government in this case was largely frivolous. So they called a banker to testify that the United States wasn't bankrupt, and they called a traveling salesman to testify that he'd never heard anybody be critical of the war, to refute the proposition that that there was division in the country over entering World War II. And the jury, not surprisingly, in a situation of wartime, convicted Pelly on all counts, and the judge sentenced him to 15 years in jail. Yeah. John Mearsheimer...
And he was no hero. He was a Nazi.
No, Pelly was no hero. Pelly was a horrible person. But he also was saying things that, as it's turned out, were in large part true. Yeah. And the fact that he was prosecuted for them, and even worse, prosecuted for them on the ground that they were false, is particularly disturbing. And so John Mearsheimer, who you mentioned, is a very distinguished historian at the University of Chicago, a political scientist, who has written extensively about these sorts of issues. And one of the findings that Mearsheimer has made is that Roosevelt did indeed manipulate the Japanese into having a situation where they really had no alternative but to attack the United States. And again, that doesn't mean that Mearsheimer is necessarily right, because these are always judgments of opinion. But the fundamental point is they could not in any sensible way be deemed false statements of fact. Yeah. The way they were determined at this jury trial, and in which Pelly was put in jail for 15 years.
Yeah. Yeah. Just to conclude, tell us a little bit, now people will know, we're starting to come to the era that a lot of people will know about. Tell us a little bit about the false statements and the dissent with regard to, on the one hand, NAM, on the other hand, with regard to Gulf II.
Well, there have been very few prosecutions directly for speech in either Vietnam or in the current situation. The false statement issue really is sort of flipped. It's the government engaging in false statement.
Exactly that the government has become the enemy of the people, or the government has become anti-American.
Right.
That's what
right.
he said.
Right. And right. So during Vietnam, the existence of the credibility gap was based upon the fact that there should have been a credibility gap, that the government was giving false reports to the American people about the progress of the war, about the casualty reports for the enemy, and as the American people became increasingly distrustful of those reports, it ultimately led to the downfall of one president, and eventually one can say the impeachment of another, and the resignation of another. And of course, in the current situation, the issue again has been raised about whether the government is being straight with the American people. Certainly the questions about weapons of mass destruction, issues about torture and Abu Ghraib, questions about Guantanamo. So there is a natural tendency, I think it's fair to say, in wartime, if not other times, for government officials to want to make things appear to the American people better than they actually are. And sometimes they let themselves cross the line between puffery of positive news to downright dishonesty with respect to negative news.
Yeah.
And what we've seen in our history is that eventually this comes to light, sometimes before, sometimes after tragedy. But I think that it's fair to say that what we saw in Vietnam with respect to this is certainly replicating itself today.
And the point I want to get at is it illustrates the importance of dissent, because there were people at all times saying what, in the case of Vietnam, most historians have come to say, and what increasingly people have come to say in the last 2 or so years with regard to this current war.
Right. A critical role dissent plays is that it allows a counter to the story being told by the government.
Yeah.
And the government can tell its story, as it did in World War I, when Wilson effectively created a committee on public information, which was a full-time propaganda operation of the federal government, whose charge it was essentially to lead the American people to hold a certain set of beliefs about Germany, about Germans, and about those people who questioned the war. And combine that with vigorous prosecution of anyone who criticized the war, then essentially the elimination of dissent enables the government to sell a one-sided picture of reality, which oftentimes may not fit actual reality. And in the current situation, there's much less in the way of direct repression of dissent, but there is a great deal of control of information and secrecy, and one of the ways in which I think this administration is trying to shape public debate is by shutting down sources of information that would allow for informed and responsible dissent if people were able to know some of the things that actually do go on.
Yeah. Jeff, you mentioned secrecy. I know that we've discussed over lunch and with the faculty the fact that secrecy has become, in the last, I don't know, 30, 40 years, it's both a Democrat and a Republican problem. There's not a problem of one party alone. And I gather it's even the problem of provosts and deans.
Right.
Has become a vehicle. It has replaced jail and prosecutions and other such things, loyalty oaths. It has become a vehicle for denying the reason of the benefits of free speech. Can you elaborate why you think that?
Historically, the way government attempted to deal with dissent was to outlaw, was to make it a crime, and we've done that throughout our history, right up through World War II with the prosecution of someone like Perilous, and certainly even during the Cold War with the prosecution of American communists. But it also has happened that both because of changes in the interpretation of law and because of changes in American culture, the prosecution of individuals who dissent, simply because of their disagreement with government policy, has become increasingly unpalatable. So we did not see the prosecution of Eugene McCarthy in 1968, and we did not see the prosecution of Howard Dean in 2004, even though they actually did not say anything different in their criticism of Vietnam or of Iraq than Eugene Debs said in World War I about the Wilson administration, or that Pelley said during World War II about Roosevelt. So we have come to be more tolerant of that, and the government therefore is loath now to criminally prosecute individuals. During the Cold War, with the opportunity to criminally prosecute reduced, the government began turning to other mechanisms: blacklisting, legislative investigations, public humiliation, exposure, and those too have now become seen as much less acceptable by the American public and by the courts. So now I think we see the government using two mechanisms primarily to shape public discourse. One of them is by withholding information, preventing the American public from knowing things that could be used to foster debate. And these could be anything from the names of the individuals detained after Guantanamo Bay, to closing all of the deportation proceedings of individuals who were deported after 9/11, to closing down government websites. And then the other thing that the government has done, and this is true through the Patriot Act and through the evisceration of the FBI guidelines within the Department of Justice, is expanding dramatically the capacity of the government to infiltrate, to engage in surveillance of individuals, to gather information about the political beliefs of American citizens, in order both to use that information in ways that can less directly punish people for their dissent, and also to intimidate them. Because if you know, for instance, that there is a public protest against the war in Iraq, and you are inclined to protest the war, and you want to go and march in it, but you know that the FBI is taking photographs and compiling names of all the people who participate in that demonstration to be put in some FBI computer, to be used in some way, somewhere down the road that you cannot control at all, you are very likely to have second thoughts about whether you will bother going to participate in that protest. One of the really fundamental things about free speech is that each of us knows that our individual capacity to affect public policy at the national level by doing anything like signing a petition or marching in a parade or handing out a leaflet is infinitesimal. And therefore, it doesn't take very much to discourage each of us individually from participating.
Right.
And so if we know that there's an FBI agent who's taking names and taking photographs, and we don't know what that's going to open us up to.
Right.
We don't know if that's going to mean someday we don't get a job, we don't get into an educational institution, we wind up having our taxes audited. There's no way to know what will happen with that information. We stay away. And the problem is each individual stays away,
right.
And the result of that, when you add up all of the individuals who are deterred, is you completely distort the debate about public issues. So the government, I think, between secrecy and between information gathering, has made a significant dent on the ability of people who are or might otherwise be uneasy about government policy to discourage them and prevent them from having the information that they would need and having the willingness that they would need to stand up for their positions.
So you never know when you're going to be in a government file. It's a source of no little embarrassment to me, Jeff, that as far as I know, I was not on the Nixon enemies list.
Well, you can always try to get on the new enemies list.
Oh, I think I made that. Jeff, do you think that, in part, the progression, if that's what it is, that you're talking about, results from the fact that not since World War II have we fought an all-out war? Because when you get into an all-out war, it's almost Katie bar the door, and that leads to a question that you were discussing at lunch with the faculty. What if we had a succession of 9/11s? What would happen? Have we as a nation just been lucky because 5 or 6 different times now we managed to escape wholesale permanent repression? And, you know, will we forever be God's chosen lucky choice in that way?
Well, a serious challenge exists for us very shortly over the horizon, and that is that it is now shortly to be possible for a small group of people to have access to weapons of mass destruction, whether chemical, biological, or nuclear, that will have the capacity to kill tens or hundreds of thousands of individuals in a single attack. And faced with that potential reality, it becomes much more difficult to know how you value individual liberties if those liberties can be seen as inconsistent with protecting the nation against those risks. And so my view, my answer to that is basically this. It is imperative that the nation protect itself and its people against catastrophic attack of that nature. And we are moving into a world where it's hard to believe such attacks will not be possible. So then one has to ask, what does it mean to say that there's a constitutional right to free speech, or a constitutional right against unreasonable searches and seizures, or a constitutional right to due process? I think what it means is that there is and must be a fundamental presumption against denying individuals those liberties unless and until the government has demonstrated that it has taken all other reasonable measures that it could take to protect the American people before resorting to restrictions on individual freedoms. And because the problem historically is that almost invariably government has tended to strike out first against individual liberties in these circumstances, not as a last resort, but really as a first resort. And so one might ask, well, why does it do that? Well, it does that first because it's easy to do, it's dramatic, it demonstrates to the citizens in a very public way that we're taking action to protect you.
Right.
And it always is targeted against a group of individuals who already is regarded by the government and the majority of the people as in some way or other undesirable. So whether it's individuals of Japanese descent, or whether it's people who once were members of the Communist Party or were affiliated with the Communist Party, or whether it's people who were regarded as secessionist sympathizers in the Civil War, or potential anarchists in World War I, you can always target these measures at a group that's the other. And so the danger here is that this is resorted to as a device by expedient government officials, not as a necessity, but as a quick and dirty and particularly dangerous way, and often a very ineffective way of actually protecting the country. So what I would say is, particularly as we move into an era in which the stakes are going to be much higher, courts have to be even more demanding about showings from the government that before they start rounding people up and putting them in detention centers, before they stop people from criticizing the government because of fears of enemy attacks, that they have to do the other things that cost money, that require hard work, whether it's dealing with the borders, or improving the computing systems of the FBI, or hiring more FBI agents and more translators. But you can't use restriction of civil liberties as the first response to these situations.
To put it in a really blunt way, catch the terrorists.
Right.
Instead of stopping people from talking, catch the terrorists. That's hard.
Right.
Stopping people from talking, that's easy.
Right.
You also mentioned, just as you've mentioned here, that courts should require this, stopping a speech only as a last resort. But let me ask you in the 30 seconds before break. You mentioned at lunch some excellent ideas, such as sunset laws on congressional action and holding off congressional action for a while. Why don't you just elaborate that as how these methods would help stop suppressions of the speech that we need in order to form the best policy?
Sure. Well, many of the problems that give rise to these overreactions and extreme restrictions of civil liberties have to do with fear and haste and acting too precipitously. So I offer several suggestions toward the end of the book about steps that we could take to restrain ourselves from repeating the mistakes of the past. So one example is, if you think of the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act was enacted very quickly with no hearings, with all of the ordinary congressional procedures suspended, in a context in which no senator or congressman, so far as I know, actually read the act before voting on it. And one thing one wants to do is to prevent that. There's not enough haste necessary to justify those kinds of activities. So one protocol would require that Congress never eliminate the ordinary procedures it follows for the enactment of legislation as a way of giving their congressmen and the public and the media an opportunity to reflect on some of these issues before things get written into law. And similar steps can be taken for the executive branch and for the judiciary, and most importantly for the public as well.
And sunset laws at the end?
Right. The other side of it with legislation is to say that when legislation is enacted on the basis of a military necessity, that they should have a very short sunset provision. That is, they automatically expire within, say, 6 months unless they're renewed. And the idea there, again, is that we do tend to act precipitously and irrationally in the face of a crisis and overreact in that context, and it's inevitable that we'll do that. And so we want to take a breath, and even though the legislation may be possibly necessary for a period of time, we should come back and revisit it. The Patriot Act actually included a sunset provision, but it was 4 years, which is much too long. But at least the concept of it is the right one.
Yeah. Some of us have suggested, some of us, I guess one person who's sitting here has suggested that maybe we should have a sunset provision built into the authorizations of war.
Yes.
Because currently wars can be fought for years on end, and Congress cannot change that fact because the president will veto a bill that tries to put a stop, and then you need 2/3 in each house and so on and so forth. We have to go to break. Be with us again in just a few minutes. We'll be right back in just a few minutes after a short break. We'll be right back with the final segment of Professor, former Dean, and former Provost Geoffrey Stone of the University of Chicago.
They came from every corner of the country, from small towns and big cities. But they all shared one thing in common. They belonged to a family called Marines, a tough and determined few dedicated to protecting everything we hold sacred. And still, they come. Celebrate the 225-year history of those proud few who have earned the title Marine.
This is the story about a group of kids who volunteered.
Doing something nice for someone.
We fixed stuff.
Did some art projects with the kids.
We fixed up his house. We worked in the woods.
Cleaned up the park.
Did something for the planet.
We just did it.
No other reason.
And you know what? It was great.
At first, they didn't know each other.
Well, that didn't last long.
This guy is really funny. Me? These are my new friends.
Are you into it?
Call 4-H or check out our website at areyouintoit.com.
Kids aren't afraid of other kids. Or people with different color skin. That's because kids know there are other things. Worse things. Bigger things to be afraid of. Like monsters from outer space! Remember, friends come in all colors.
Before you know it, she talks. Before you know it, she walks. Before you know it, she knows you. Before you know it, she has a heart. Before you know you're pregnant, when your baby's no bigger than a grain of rice. Before she's a twinkle in your eye, that's when you need to take folic acid every day. After that, it's too late to prevent some serious birth defects. Folic acid now, before you know it.
Welcome back. Jeff, one of the other themes that is pervasive in the book, and therefore in American history, is the fact that aliens in the United States have always been a major problem in terms of suppression of free speech, starting way back in 1798 with Frenchmen who were here in the United States. Would you elaborate for us a little bit on how this has occurred throughout history, right up until our own day?
Right. Well, in wartime, of course, there's always the problem of loyalty. And who is least likely to be loyal of the people in your country than citizens of an enemy nation? If you or I happen to have been in Germany in December 1941, and the United States went to war with Germany, we would probably like to think that we would have done what we could for the American cause. And so, flipping that, it's understandable that the American government has always been particularly concerned about enemy aliens who are in the United States during periods of wartime. And in between, the role of citizens and enemy aliens are simply aliens. That is, they're citizens of countries other than the ones with which we are at war. And they have no necessary allegiance to the United States, so you can't assume that they will be quite as trustworthy as would hopefully American citizens be. So this has been a major concern from the beginning. In the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798, the government passed both the Enemy Alien Act, which basically gave the president the authority to detain citizens of a nation with whom we are at war, and that's still on the books.
That would have been France.
That would have been France,
yep.
And that law continues on the books to this very day, and it's the basis for government action when we have detained individuals like Germans and Italians during World War II who were in the United States. It gave the president the authority to promulgate regulations to detain them. And then the other part of the Alien Act applied to non-enemy aliens, and it just simply said that the president of the United States would have the authority to detain and to deport any alien who the president found to be a danger to the nation without any hearing, without any opportunity to present evidence. And these were aliens who were not citizens of any enemy nation. And that was repealed in 1801 by Thomas Jefferson when he became president. So throughout American history, this problem has always occurred again. During World War I, the primary issue involved Germans. And the United States did, in fact, have German citizens who were in the United States register and report and detained some of them who were found to be potentially dangerous.
Were they people who were trying to immigrate to the United States?
You mean obtaining American citizenship?
Yes.
It didn't matter. If they were in the United States and they hadn't already obtained American citizenship, then they were citizens of Germany and they had to be, under the law, looked at carefully. During World War II, a sharp division was made, of course, between Italian and German citizens and individuals of Japanese descent. So individuals of Italian and German who were citizens were all required to report, and they were detained briefly and given hearings to determine whether they posed a danger. The vast majority were not detained, but were told they could go to their homes, but there were limitations placed on. They couldn't own weapons, they couldn't own shortwave radios, and so on. But of course, for people of Japanese descent, whether Japanese citizens or Japanese Americans, about 120,000 of them were interned, two-thirds of whom were American citizens, totally different issue. And of course, at the present time, there are...
Can I go back to that for just a minute?
Absolutely.
Were they also American citizens in Hawaii? Because there was no internment of Japanese, people of Japanese ancestry in Hawaii. I've always thought basically because there were so many of them as opposed to the West Coast.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, there was no internment in Hawaii, and the answer undoubtedly is that there were so many, and that was part of the justification given for not interning the German and Italian Americans and enemies as well, because there were so many. Although it would have been very easy to detain the German and Italian citizens in the United States, because there were more people of Japanese descent than they were German and Italian citizens. So we actually treated the German and Italian citizens better than we did Japanese Americans, which is really the astonishing thing about the evil of the internment during World War II. Right, pure racism. Right. And of course, in the current situation, there is the concern about how we've dealt with individuals in the United States from Middle Eastern countries or Muslim countries who are here as aliens legally and who have been rounded up after 9/11 and were held in New York and New Jersey, and many of whom were then later deported. So there's a constant question about how you deal with aliens in this circumstance. And it is built into the problem of if you're at war with somebody, you know, there's very good reason not to be happy that some of their citizens are.
And doesn't it, Jeff, go beyond people who technically are aliens, so that, for example, in World War I it encompassed German Americans who were citizens. They might have been second and third generation. As you pointed out, it encompassed Japanese American citizens. Today we have a lot of Pakistanis and people from other countries in the Middle East who are American citizens, people from Syria, from Lebanon. And they're all being hit to some extent.
American citizens of different backgrounds in general have not been subjected to governmental repression, much more private repression. So during World War I, there were lynchings of German Americans, and the very fact of having a German name and speaking the German language and eating German foods was regarded as a sign of disloyalty. But the only time that a group of American citizens was targeted simply because of their ancestry was during World War II, when the government itself went out and seized 80 to 90,000 American citizens and incarcerated them.
There was, at least as of a year or two ago, a lot of bad feeling among private people about Middle East people who were descended from Middle Eastern parents and grandparents who were citizens in this country and were thought perhaps not to be trustworthy. Indeed, it turned out that some of them were members of Al-Qaeda and so forth, but not by and large.
Right. No, the problem of fear of a group is endemic to human nature. And once there's a judgment that people in a group, whether it be people of Japanese descent on the West Coast, or after 9/11, people who are Muslim or people who are Arab descent, are seen as suspicious. And that's what prejudice is. And it's a horrible thing to cope with, because it's not completely irrational. Some people within those groups may, in fact, be dangerous. And how you deal with the fact that 99 out of 100 aren't, but one of them is really the same problem we have with race relations in the United States. It's not really any different than that.
Jeff, we have about 30, 40 seconds left, and I'd like you to comment on what your view in terms of civil liberties, and more broadly, therefore, is of Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman.
Well, in terms of civil liberties, Roosevelt was not a hero. Roosevelt was quite aggressive about unleashing the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover. He authorized the internment largely for political reasons. He was very aggressive about ordering his Attorney General to prosecute those who were critical of him. So one would not hold Roosevelt up as a paradigm of civil liberties. Truman was more mixed. Truman was caught in a bind. He was being attacked from both the right and the left politically. He was being accused of being soft on communists by the right, and then from the left, from Henry Wallace, he was being accused of being too hostile to the Soviet Union. And early in his presidency, he yielded too much to the right and put in place the loyalty program for the federal government, which he later deeply regretted. Truman believed that it would not be subject to terrible abuse, but it turned out to be a disaster and led ultimately to the period we now think of as McCarthy.
It unleashed the furies.
Right, but Truman regretted that forever and became a very strong spokesman for civil liberties by 1951.
Well, Jeff, thank you very much. We have to wrap this up. Thank you very much. We could talk for another 3 or 4 hours.
Thank you so much for having me, Larry.
To the audience, thank you, and be with us again.